I hadn't planned to speak that day, but when I saw his coffin resting at the front of the chapel, polished so carefully it reflected the stained glass windows, something inside me finally refused to stay quiet. The room smelled like lilies and old wood, that familiar church smell that always made me feel small. People sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering stories about a man they thought they knew. They said his name gently, like it deserved softness. They talked about his laughter, his generosity, his hard work. I sat in the third row, hands folded in my lap, listening to a version of my ex-husband that never lived in my house. My hands were shaking, though I tried to still them by pressing my palms together. 20 years, that's how long I had stayed silent. 20 years of swallowing words, of correcting myself mid-thought, of choosing peace over truth, or at least, what I told myself was peace. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to share a memory, the room went quiet. I could hear the hum of the air vents, the soft sniffle of someone crying behind me. My heart started beating so loud I was sure others could hear it, and before I could stop myself, I stood up. Before all of this, before the funeral, before the silence, before the story that followed me like a shadow, my life was simple. Not easy, but simple, the kind of life you build slowly, brick by brick, believing that if you try hard enough and love deeply enough, things will eventually settle into place. I met Daniel when I was 24. He was charming in a quiet way, not loud or flashy. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, people leaned in. He had this habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was nervous, a small gesture that made him seem human, approachable. I noticed things like that back then. I notice them even more now. We married 2 years later in a modest ceremony, cream, colored roses, my mother's old pearl earrings, a cake that leaned slightly to the left because the bakery rushed it. Daniel squeezed my hand during the vows, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the man who will know me for the rest of my life. For a while, that felt true. We bought a small house with squeaky floors and a narrow kitchen where you had to turn sideways if 2 people were cooking at once. On Sunday mornings, Daniel made coffee too strong, and I burned the toast more often than not. We laughed about it. We had routines, familiar fights that ended in apologies before bedtime, ordinary love, the kind you don't realize is precious until it's gone. But there were cracks, small ones at first. He started coming home later, not outrageously late, just late enough that dinner had gone cold. He stopped telling me stories about work. When I asked questions, he'd answer, but vaguely, like he didn't want to give too much away. I told myself it was stress. Everyone gets tired. Everyone changes a little over time. The first real clue came on a Tuesday evening. I remember, because Tuesdays were laundry days, and the washing machine always rattled too loud during the spin cycle. Daniel came home, tossed his keys on the counter, and walked straight past me without a kiss. "You okay?" I asked. "Just exhausted," he said, already loosening his tie, but his voice sounded distant, like he was already somewhere else. Later that night, while folding his shirts, I noticed a faint smell, unfamiliar perfume, light but deliberate. Not mine. I stood there holding the fabric, the hum of the dryer filling the room, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Elevator, office, someone passing by too closely. That's the thing about the beginning of betrayal. It asks you to choose between instinct and hope. And hope is persuasive. The days that followed felt slightly off, kilter, like a picture hanging crooked on the wall. Nothing dramatic happened. No screaming matches, no obvious lies, just absences, glances that didn't last long enough. Silence where conversation used to live. When I finally asked him directly, he laughed, not cruelly, but dismissively. "You're imagining things," he said. "You worry too much." And I wanted to believe him, because believing him meant I didn't have to face the alternative. The truth arrived quietly, like it was ashamed of itself. I found the receipt in his jacket pocket. Dinner for 2 at a restaurant we used to save for anniversaries. The date was from a night he'd told me he was working late. My chest tightened, but I still didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of the bed, the receipt shaking in my hand, rehearsing conversations that might save us. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He sighed, sat down heavily, ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't plan for it to happen," he said. "It just did." That sentence, "it just did," lodged itself somewhere deep in me. As if choices were weather, as if betrayal was accidental. The weeks after that were a blur of whispered arguments and long silences. He promised to end it. He promised to try. But promises, I learned, mean very little when they're spoken out of guilt instead of commitment. Eventually, he left, not dramatically. He packed a suitcase, avoided my eyes, and said he needed space. I stood in the doorway watching the man I married walk away, carrying pieces of our life like they were replaceable. What I didn't know then was that this wasn't the end of the damage. It was only the beginning, because while Daniel left our marriage, he didn't leave my life. Not completely. He left behind stories, lies. A version of events that painted him as misunderstood and me as unstable. He told people I was controlling, that I pushed him away, that I exaggerated, and I let him. For years, I let him. I told myself staying silent was strength, that dignity meant not defending myself, that time would straighten the story. 20 years passed like that. And then I found myself sitting in that church, staring at his coffin, realizing silence has a cost. Some debts wait patiently. After Daniel left, life didn't collapse the way I thought it would. It thinned out instead, like soup stretched too far with water. Everything was still there, the house, the job, the routines, but the flavor was gone. I kept the same morning habits for a while. I made coffee for 2 before catching myself. I listened for his car in the driveway at night, even after I knew it wouldn't come. Grief has a way of embarrassing you like that. It exposes how much of yourself you gave away without noticing. People chose sides quietly. No one ever announced it. Invitations just stopped coming. Conversations shifted when I walked into a room. Daniel had always been good with people, warm, reasonable, the kind of man others trusted instinctively. When he spoke about our marriage ending, he sounded wounded but noble. "She needs time," I heard he'd said. "She's always been sensitive. I didn't want it to end this way. I became a story he told better than I ever could." At work, I focused on being reliable, early mornings, late evenings. I learned the comfort of predictable tasks, spreadsheets, emails, meetings that ended on time. My supervisor once told me I had a calming presence. I smiled at that. Calm was something I learned the hard way. I didn't date for a long time, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. When someone lies to you long enough, you start wondering how you missed it and whether you'd miss it again. Daniel remarried within 3 years. I heard about it from a coworker who didn't realize who I was talking about. She described the wedding casually, the way people do when they assume a story has no teeth. "He seems really happy now," she said. I nodded, took a sip of my coffee, burned my tongue and welcomed the sting. It felt grounding. What hurt wasn't that he moved on. It was how easily the past had been rewritten. How quickly the years we spent building something were reduced to a misunderstanding. Still, I stayed quiet. My mother once asked me why I never corrected anyone when they repeated his version of events. We were sitting at her kitchen table, the radio humming softly in the background. Because, I told her, I don't want to live my life arguing with ghosts. At the time, that felt wise. Years passed. I changed my hair, my job, eventually my address. I learned to be content in smaller ways, morning walks, second-hand books, dinners with friends who didn't ask too many questions. I grew steadier, less reactive. The pain dulled into something manageable, like an old injury that only aches when the weather changes. Daniel and I rarely spoke. Birthdays, the occasional holiday text, polite, careful, as if we were strangers who shared a long, uncomfortable memory. Then, about a year before he died, he called me. I almost didn't answer. His name on my phone felt out of place, like a letter delivered years too late. "Hi," he said when I picked up. His voice sounded older, rougher. "I just wanted to check in," he continued. "See how you're doing." I remember looking out my window at the time. A woman across the street was watering her plants, humming to herself. Life continuing, unaware of the moment quietly unfolding in my living room. "I'm fine," I said, and I was mostly. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important, weather, work. He told me he wasn't feeling well lately. Doctor's tests, I offered polite concern. Before hanging up, he hesitated. "There's something I always meant to say," he said, "but maybe it's not the right time." I waited. "I'm sorry," he finally said, "for the way things ended." It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was vague, incomplete. A door cracked open and quickly closed. "Thank you," I replied. That was all I had in me. When I learned he had died suddenly months later, I felt a complicated mix of things. Sadness, yes, but also a strange disorientation. The past, unfinished, had now become unchangeable. The invitation to the funeral arrived in a simple envelope. His wife had included a short note. "Daniel always spoke of you with respect," she wrote. "I thought you might want to come." I sat with that letter for a long time. The word respect felt heavy, loaded with meanings it didn't quite earn. I debated going. Part of me wanted to stay home to let the past remain sealed. Another part, quieter, more persistent, felt like this might be the last moment where truth could breathe. The morning of the funeral, I stood in front of my closet longer than necessary. I chose a dark blue dress, not black, not mourning exactly. Something neutral, honest. At the church, I slipped into a seat without drawing attention. People nodded politely. Some recognized me, surprise flickering briefly across their faces before being replaced with practiced sympathy. As the service unfolded, stories were shared, versions of Daniel polished by time and affection. I listened carefully, not with bitterness, but with a growing sense of imbalance. Something was missing, a chapter erased. When the pastor asked if anyone wished to speak, the silence stretched. My heart started racing. I told myself to stay seated, to let it pass, to protect the life I'd built from reopening old wounds. But then I remembered the phone call, the almost apology, the weight of 20 years pressed down on me. I stood, I felt every eye turn toward me. The room seemed to tilt slightly, like it was waiting to see which way I would fall. I walked to the front slowly, my legs steady even as my hands trembled. The microphone smelled faintly of metal and cleaning solution. I gripped the edge of the podium, grounding myself. "My name is Claire." I began. My voice sounded calm, almost detached. "I was married to Daniel for 12 years. A murmur rippled through the room. I wasn't sure whether to speak today. I continued. But I realized that if I didn't, I would carry this silence with me forever. I paused, letting the moment settle. And then, gently, I told the truth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse or dramatize. I spoke the way I had learned to speak over the years, carefully, truthfully, without ornament. "I love Daniel," I said. "I still respect the parts of him that were kind, that were thoughtful, that showed up when it mattered." His wife sat in the front row, her back straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. I could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she leaned forward just a fraction, listening. "But love doesn't erase harm," I continued, "and remembering someone honestly means holding all of who they were, not just the parts that were easy to love." The room was quiet enough that I could hear my own breath. "I stayed silent for many years," I said. Not because there was nothing to say, but because I believed silence was the kinder choice. I glanced at the coffin, then back at the faces watching me. Some looked confused, others uncomfortable. A few, surprisingly, looked relieved. When our marriage ended, it wasn't because of distance or misunderstanding, I said. It ended because Daniel chose someone else and chose not to tell the truth about it. A sharp inhale from somewhere behind me. I didn't look. I'm not here to shame him. I added quickly. He made choices, as we all do. But those choices had consequences, ones that didn't end when he walked away. I spoke about the months of confusion. The lies told gently enough to seem believable. The way my character had been questioned while I kept my mouth shut. I allowed people to believe I was difficult. I said that I was unstable because correcting them felt louder than I was ready to be. My voice wavered then just slightly. I steadied it, but silence isn't the same as forgiveness, I said, and it isn't healing. I felt something shift in the room, not anger, but understanding. The kind that arrives late and quietly. I want to be clear, I continued. Daniel was not a monster. He was human. He was capable of generosity and warmth. He was also capable of avoiding responsibility. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. I believe he carried regret, I said, and I believe he wanted to make things right but didn't know how. His wife stood up then. The movement startled me, but she didn't interrupt. She turned to face the room, then looked at me. I didn't know, she said softly. Her voice trembled. He told me the marriage ended because you grew apart. I nodded. That's what he told many people. Tears welled in her eyes. She pressed a hand to her mouth, shaking her head. I'm sorry, she said, not just to me, but to the room. That moment, unexpected, unscripted, changed the tone entirely. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a reckoning. I stepped down from the podium slowly, my legs finally beginning to feel weak. As I returned to my seat, someone reached out and squeezed my hand. Then another, small gestures, but they mattered. After the service, people approached me hesitantly. I never knew. One woman whispered, I always wondered, said another. I'm glad you spoke, someone else murmured, eyes wet. Not everyone reacted kindly. A few avoided me entirely. One man shook his head disapprovingly as he passed. I let him. Outside, the air felt lighter. The sky was pale and overcast, the kind of day that feels unfinished. Daniel's wife stood near the steps, staring down at her hands. I wish I'd known sooner, she said when I approached. So do I replied, and I meant it. We stood together in silence for a moment, two women connected by the same man, the same incomplete truth. I don't hate him, she said quietly, but I don't know how to grieve him now. I looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't my enemy. She never had been. Grief doesn't require pretending. I said, it just asks you to be honest. She nodded, tears slipping free. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects reached farther than I expected. Old friends called to apologize. Family members admitted they'd believed the wrong things. Some relationships couldn't be repaired. Too much time had passed. Others surprised me with their resilience. I felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because the truth no longer lived only inside me. One evening, sitting alone in my living room, I realized I hadn't thought about Daniel all day. Not with anger or longing, just a distant, settled awareness. I had told my story, and for the first time in 20 years, it no longer owned me. Life didn't change all at once after the funeral. There was no dramatic sunrise, no sudden feeling of freedom the next morning. What changed was quieter than that. Subtle, like a knot slowly loosening after being pulled tight for years. For a while, I felt exposed. Telling the truth publicly had lifted a weight, but it also left me tender. Old memories resurfaced at odd moments, the sound of Daniel's laugh, the way he used to hum while shaving, the sharp edge of his silence in those last months together. I let those memories come and go without fighting them. That was new for me. I had spent so long pushing them down, afraid of what they might demand from me. A week after the funeral, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. The envelope was thick, the paper inside cream, colored and faintly scented. It was from Daniel's wife. She wrote about how shaken she'd been, how she had gone through old emails, old calendars, timelines that no longer made sense. She wrote about anger, not at me, but at the realization that the man she loved had been capable of such careful omission. I don't know what to do with this truth yet, she wrote, but I wanted you to know that I believe you and I'm sorry." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not as evidence, not as closure, just as something real. The conversations continued. Some people reached out with genuine remorse. Others seemed more interested in easing their own guilt than understanding mine. I learned to tell the difference quickly. I didn't owe anyone comfort anymore. One afternoon, I ran into Daniel's sister at the grocery store. We hadn't spoken in years. She stood there clutching a basket of apples, her face pale. "I always thought you were exaggerating," she said bluntly. I didn't realize how wrong I was. I nodded. "I know. I should have asked more questions," she added. "Yes," I said again. "It wasn't cruel. It was honest." That was another thing I was learning. Honesty doesn't need to be loud to be firm. At home, I began sorting through old boxes. Things I'd packed away when Daniel left and never reopened. Photos, cards, receipts, a small velvet box with a watch I'd bought him for our 10th anniversary, never given because the moment passed. I sat on the floor surrounded by those artifacts, dust clinging to my fingertips, and felt something close to gratitude. Not for the pain, never that, but for the distance, for the proof that I had survived something I once thought would break me permanently. I threw some things away. I kept others. I wasn't erasing him from my life. I was repositioning him, giving him a place that no longer crowded everything else. There was one afternoon, weeks later, when I realized something important. I was laughing, really laughing, on the phone with a friend, talking about nothing particularly meaningful. The sound surprised me. It felt unguarded. After I hung up, I sat there for a moment, letting that feeling settle. Joy didn't feel dangerous anymore. I started walking in the mornings again. The same route, the same cracked sidewalks, the same old maple tree on the corner that dropped leaves earlier than the rest. As I walked, I noticed details I'd missed before: the smell of damp earth, the distant bark of a dog, the way sunlight filtered through branches like it was choosing where to land. One morning, I stopped beneath that maple tree and thought about the woman I had been 20 years earlier, the one who believed silence was strength, the one who mistook endurance for healing. I wished I could reach back and tell her that her voice mattered, not because it would punish anyone, but because it would free her. But we learn when we're ready, no sooner, no later. People often think speaking the truth is about confrontation, about exposing someone else. For me, it was about reclaiming myself, about aligning my inner life with the life I showed the world. Daniel's death closed a door I hadn't realized was still open. For years, part of me had waited for an apology, an explanation, a chance to be understood. Letting go of that waiting was its own kind of grief, but it was also a release. I stopped wondering how things might have been different if I'd spoken sooner. Regret, I learned, can be another form of silence, one that keeps you stuck in the past. I chose not to live there anymore. Instead, I focused on the present, on the relationships that remained, on the quiet satisfaction of knowing that my story now existed outside of me, unhidden, unashamed. Some evenings I still think of Daniel, not with bitterness, not with longing, just with clarity. He was a man who made choices, some kind, some cowardly. I no longer need him to be more or less than that, and I no longer need to carry his unfinished apologies. I had spoken, that was enough. In the months that followed, something unexpected happened. People began telling me their stories. It started quietly. A coworker lingering after a meeting, a neighbor stopping me during my morning walk. Women mostly, some younger, some older. They spoke in low voices as if the walls might still be listening. I stayed because it was easier. One woman admitted, eyes fixed on the floor. "He told everyone I was the problem," said another, her jaw tightening. I never corrected the story. Someone else whispered. I thought it didn't matter. I listened, not as someone with answers, but as someone who understood the cost of silence. I realized then that my words at the funeral hadn't just been about Daniel. They had landed in places I'd never see inside marriages, inside old wounds, inside women who were still deciding whether their truth was worth the risk. That knowledge humbled me. It also steadied me. One afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. "Claire?" The voice said when I answered, "It's Mark, Daniel's cousin." We hadn't spoken in years. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "I said things back then, about you. I believed what I was told." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, not anger, not sadness, just recognition. "Thank you for calling," I said. There was a pause. "I hope you know some of us always wondered." That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. Some of us always wondered. Truth has a way of making itself known, even when it's buried. I didn't expect everyone to change their minds. Some didn't, some never reached out, and I was okay with that. Healing, I learned, doesn't require universal agreement. What it requires is alignment between who you are and what you allow to be said about you. I began saying no more often, to invitations that felt obligatory, to conversations that circled back to old pain, to people who wanted me to soften my truth to make them more comfortable. Instead, I said yes to things that felt nourishing: long dinners with friends, quiet weekends, a writing class I'd always talked myself out of before. I found pleasure in being a beginner again, in putting words on paper without worrying how they'd be received. Writing surprised me. I didn't write about Daniel at first. I wrote about childhood memories, about my mother's laugh, about the way time bends around grief. Slowly, without forcing it, the story of my marriage found its way onto the page, not as an accusation, but as a record. One evening, as I reread something I'd written, I noticed the tone. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't apologetic. It was clear. That felt like progress. I ran into Daniel's wife once more, months later, at a cafe across town. She looked thinner, older somehow, as grief often makes us. We exchanged polite greetings, then sat together without planning to. "I'm still sorting through things," she said. "What was real, what wasn't. I know," I replied. "I wish he'd been braver," she said quietly. "So do I," I said, not just for her, for myself, for him too. She looked at me then, really looked at me. "Thank you," she said, "for telling the truth when it was hard." I nodded. That was all that needed to be said. As we parted ways, I felt no resentment, no triumph, just a quiet sense of completion. Our lives had intersected through deception, but they didn't have to end in hostility. At home that night, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I noticed lines around my eyes that hadn't been there 20 years ago. Gray strands I no longer bothered to dye, a steadiness in my gaze that felt earned. I thought about the younger version of myself, the woman who believed being silent was the same as being strong. Strength, I had learned, looks different up close. Sometimes it looks like speaking gently in a room that expects quiet. Sometimes it looks like letting go of the need to be understood by everyone. And sometimes it looks like standing up once, just once, and changing the story forever. I didn't regret waiting. That surprised me. Regret had been my constant companion for so long that I assumed it would always be there. But timing matters. Truth spoken too early can be dismissed. Truth spoken when you're ready carries weight. I was ready. The silence that followed my words was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. These days, my life is quieter than it used to be. Not empty, just honest. The kind of quiet where you can hear yourself think without flinching. Sometimes in the early morning, I sit by the window with my coffee and watch the world wake up. Cars pass. Birds argue over crumbs. Somewhere, someone is beginning a story they don't yet know will change them. I think about how long I believed my own voice didn't matter, how I confused endurance with dignity, silence with grace. What I know now is this: truth doesn't demand urgency, it asks for readiness, I stayed silent for 20 years, and I no longer judge that version of myself. She did the best she could with what she had. She survived, and when the moment finally came, the right moment, she stood up and spoke, not to destroy anyone, but to finally stop disappearing. Telling my story didn't rewrite the past, it didn't erase the hurt, but it gave me something I didn't realize I'd been missing all along: alignment. Peace that comes from no longer carrying someone else's lies as your burden. If you're listening to this and holding your own truth quietly inside you, I want you to know something. You are not weak for surviving the way you had to, and you're not late for healing. There is no expiration date on reclaiming yourself. Some stories need time. Some truths need distance. And some silences are only temporary, not because we're afraid, but because we're preparing. I told my story once in a room that wasn't expecting it, and that was enough. So I'll leave you with this question, one I had to ask myself before I stood up that day. If the moment came, would you speak? If this story resonated with you, or reminded you of something you've lived through, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to support more stories like this, honest, human, and quietly brave, consider subscribing. You're not alone, and your story matters more than you think.